questions here. I'm going to try to go really fast. We have enough time for the discussion, so I'm going to talk really a little bit fast. I hope you can follow. I just want to make 3 points. One is how the scientific value system overall has changed, and to come back to this DORA declaration that I mentioned in my first talk today, in pointing out how the metrics system we apply across the world really for research assessment have really come to undermine research as we do it at the moment. And then since you specifically asked me to speak on predatory journals and in fact predatory conferences, so I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of that too, because it's becoming a real nuisance. Just as a background, it's worth remembering where publishing came from. It came from the Age of Enlightenment in the 17th century when people had real fun doing science. And here you can see an image of, it was really gentlemen's at the time, not women's, gentlemen's pursuit. And people would just share information when they found really exciting stuff, like vacuum here on this painting. And the first research paper was actually in 1650 by Robert Boyle of the Boyle's Law. That was the very first research paper that you can see on the right. Very rapidly followed by the first journal, by the Royal Society in London, which was just 15 years later founded by Henry Oldenburg, the very first editor. So there was a time when we started getting more systematic about sharing research information, but peer review only came about in the 1960s, really. At the time, you would share what you found, and people would evaluate it on reading it. Post-publication peer review, very fashionable now. And just to point out the speed, this is the diary entry from Darwin on the first concept of an evolutionary tree. And I thought to show this in India, since this has been questioned nowadays, it seems, by the governments. This took another, as you can see, almost 25 years, I think it was, before it was published as a research book in this case. But the speed was entirely different to now. And if you look now, what happened is the speed has accelerated dramatically. And we've changed from selecting really not just for quality and reproducibility, which is what original peer review did in the 60s, to selecting for sexiness. As Bob showed you a graph of the explosion of intermediate filaments, I'm going to superimpose that on the explosion of science in general. We are publishing 28,000 journals by the latest estimates, more than almost 3 million papers that claim to be peer-reviewed per year now, just in the biosciences. It's still growing unabated at 5%, and you can immediately see that the human brain can simply not absorb this level of information anymore. So we've really had to fall back on proxy measures. I'm also struggling to move forward. On proxy measures to validate the science. And what's better than to go to journals? So journals have started to select much more for interest and novelty, or if you want, sexiness to some extent, than just simply for quality. And we have come to a simple equation that the academic currency we're all evaluated on is really measured by the scientific papers we publish. So value and impact of your work is essentially entirely measured by where you publish and what impact factor that journal may have. Important to point out that this explosion has then also led to an explosion not just of all journals, but especially also of what you might want to call high-impact journals. And here's the evolutionary tree from Darwin superimposed on Nature. There's about 43 Nature-titled journals now. When I worked at Nature as an editor, we had 3 journals. So this is how it's changed from 1869, when it had the subheading of "to aid the scientific men themselves," to now where the main headline is its impact factor. And in fact, they went as far as selling the journal for the price of the impact factor, to 3 decimal places, which was particularly nauseating, I thought. But they have now changed that, as you will see in a second. Now, DORA came out of this state of affairs, and it was a small group of publishers at the American Society for Cell Biology meeting about in 2013 that came together and said, we have to do something about this. There's a responsibility of journals, and we have to move away from this misleading impact factor. So what we set is to have a declaration to point out the problems with simplistic metrics. And what some journals, such as ours at EMBO, have done is to actually start to report all the metrics we can, and to report them in a way that doesn't just take the mean of citations across all the papers we publish, but to show the whole distributions, which you immediately see is highly skewed and is really governed by outliers. So basically, an individual paper in the journal is not at all related to the average, which is the impact factor of the journal. Has now signed up to DORA also, which is great. Earlier in 2017, all the Nature journals signed up to DORA, and all Springer Nature journals did. So we are very pleased by that. Although I've just noticed that there's been a brief relapse. I got a letter from the 23rd of January sent that basically shows that one Nature journal still says, our objective is to place the journal in this impact factor of 14.098. So please review it with keeping that in mind. So this is hopefully temporary relapse. Now there's another corrupting influence, which is not by the journals but by the funders. And as you know, certain countries, and this is not only in Asia, this is also very prevalent in Europe, have actually gone to give cash rewards by impact factor. And there's hardwired algorithms to calculate these. And this has been studied quite in some detail in China, and I'm not going to go into details. But there's up to several $100,000 given for papers in highly prestigious journals now. And we all know that money corrupts, so this is not a healthy state of affairs. And I would strongly encourage you in India to resist these temptations, because it just doesn't, it always ends in tears. Let's move. Oh, okay, so basically this has led to another development, which is publishing at all costs. And I would like to call this vanity publishing. This is publishing not to share important science, but to get that paper out, because that is what is required for your research grant or for your career. It doesn't matter what's in the paper, you just need that paper out in a journal that has a good name or a sexy name itself. Consider that most papers have more authors than readers nowadays. That's a bad state of affairs. Half the literature we publish is never at all cited. Impact factors are bad, but citations mean something. And if a paper is never ever cited, that means something. So just to close, I wanted to give you a couple of points on predatory journals and what I would like to call bogus conferences. The problem is that some of these things are accelerated dramatically by open access, unfortunately. We all support open access, but because of the business model of open access, there's journals that make some money by basically pouncing on people that are under desperate need to publish. And I will show you a couple of examples if I ever manage to move forward. Here, this is just from the last week. I get about one invitation per day now to submit a paper to a predatory journal, or to sit on some committee to become an editor of a predatory journal, or to go to a conference. This is just from the last 2 or 3 days, the recent invitations that I got. And I looked into one of them that came in 3 days ago here on LinkedIn, and it has a nice website. It looks all very nice, Pass or Plus or whatever it's called, in London. So this is not just in Asia. And you go into it, and here's the program. It's in July. They invited me to chair a session, and the program is that. It's a white page. So it's a bit surprising that now I know that this conference was already organized for 4 years. You had the program up already about a year ago. So this is disturbing me a little bit. This is nothing new, of course, to you. This has been covered also in the main media for many years. And what's disturbing is it's getting worse. It's not getting better. Here's one article in the New York Times on the matter. There's been several sting operations, which you probably know. The most famous one is on the top left here in Science, where John Bannon basically submitted a bogus paper to a whole bunch of journals, and found that dozens of them accepted the paper. The most extreme illustrations on the bottom left here, where a paper called "Get Me Fucking Off Your Mailing List" was published in a journal for the cost of $150, basically. And what's disturbing is that this is not just a one-off. This is actually something that's systemic. So there was another sting operation that was just published in March of 2017 in Nature, where they invented, a group in Poland invented this fictitious person called Anna Olga Zust, and she managed to get onto many journals, 48 out of 360 journals that were tested, the vast majority of which, 40 of which were classified as predatory journals, invited her immediately to join the editorial board, even though she does not exist. And that's completely clear from Google, if you spend 2 seconds on Google. Now, lists have been published, and if you're worried about where to publish, please try to find a list of predatory journals before you fall victim to them. The list on the bottom here has shown names that were stolen from existing journals by predatory journals. So you can find these lists on the internet. I'm not going to go into details, apart from saying that the most famous of them, Beale's list, has actually been removed because, presumably, because of pressures, legal pressures from certain publishers. And just to give you one very recent example, why this is important, because it's been used by people to inform the public and the politicians. And here is an article from the 24th of January on climate change, how climate change skeptics have used these journals to basically get their message out. And unfortunately, this article also quotes, these journals and hundreds more like them are mostly based in the Indian subcontinent or China and are part of a ballooning online industry. So it is very important to rein this in because it's extremely damaging for science. And here you have our usual suspects that, of course, love to pick up on these things. Donald Trump, again, up here, 2012. The concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese, of course. And they love to have evidence for those statements, and those evidence is given often in these fake journals. So this is really important. Whereas on the same, just yesterday, Mr. Modi in Davos said mitigating the menace of climate change must be collective responsibility of all nations, which is, of course, wonderful. Instead, and the same day, Donald Trump also refers to predatory journals, but instead refers to predatory trade. Which is all he's interested in. Now, it's not all well in India, though. I did want to come back to this, this issue just very briefly, that of Darwin. Oops, I'm going back and forth. Of Darwin, because unfortunately the science minister in India, as you probably heard, just very recently, a couple of days ago, declared that Darwin's theory is scientifically wrong. It needs to change in the school and the college curriculum. Nobody ever saw an ape turning into a human, which is not actually what Darwin said, of course, at all. So this is a bit unfortunate. So it is, again, important to push back on these issues very actively as a scientific community. And we need to rein in these journals because they use this evidence for these misleading statements. So don't fall for these rogue journals. Check the editors and the board members of the journals you submit to, and check the organizers and speakers of conferences you may want to go to. Look for telltale signs. Often these use the most ridiculous text. And I'm just quoting 4 different pieces of text from the Guardian article that came out a couple of days ago. I'm not going to read them out, but it's completely clear immediately that these journals are bogus because of the information they provide. Often they have very opaque costs or editorial and scientific processes on their web pages. They're extremely cheap often, which is of course a telltale sign. Look at the track record. Have they ever been cited by others? Do they spam you with information? Do they send you an alert every day? Do ask colleagues before you go to them. And there is a helpful information website that outlines a lot of these things. It's called Think, Check, Submit. So I would invite you, as students especially, to go and have a look at that. It gives you some handy hints. And I think I'm going to stop there. That's my last slide. I think push back. This is a letter that actually the director of EMBO sent back to one of these spam emails saying, Dear Mrs. Andrews, it's pretty appalling to call yourself J-cell biology and hope that some naive people may not notice that you are not the highly respected Journal of Cell Biology. I wouldn't dream of sending any papers to such crooks as you are. So I think it's useful to come together as a community. As you know, the governments are also starting to act. For once, here is a great thing that Americans are doing. So this is the Federal Trade Commission who has now called out and provided a subpoena for enterprises such as Omics, which is actually in Hyderabad. So they, Omics, as you know, publishes over 700 journals and organizes 3,000 conferences. And I will state for the record that they deny all these charges. When you communicate your science, avoid spin. We've been through this already in the other talk. The reproducibility we discussed, it's very important that you yourself also look at these issues beyond the rogue journals and ensure that you communicate science in a reproducible way and in an authentic and unbiased way. Do remember that. We've been through the issues of ethical misconduct. Here's a celebrity case, again, makes the headlines in the New York Times, even with an animated Western blot on the front line of the first page of the New York Times. Extremely damaging for science. And here's a few solutions, and I'm going to stop talking so we can have a discussion. Thank you very much.